Hey there, AP Gov students. Just wanted to pick up with some more executive branch notes. We started this on Friday, and these notes are for your asynchronous day on Monday. So on Friday, we started talking about some of the powers that the president has, some of the roles that he fulfills. And today, we're just going to continue. We're going to finish up that section so that we're ready on Tuesday to move on with some other things. Remember, today you've got some content notes here in this video, and you've also got your must know quiz on facts 41 through 60. So make sure both of those get done by Monday. So that way on Tuesday, we can be ready to continue with executive branch. So let's talk about the president's role when it comes to diplomacy. Um, as has been the theme with the executive branch, the president has taken on a bigger role, especially since the 20th century, when it comes to diplomacy. The president negotiates with foreign leaders. He is absolutely the point person when it comes to um, anything foreign relations related. So the president receives ambassadors from other nations and meets with foreign leaders. You can see some examples here. Um, President Nixon meeting with Chairman Mao, President Franklin Roosevelt meeting with Stalin and Winston Churchill. This was, I believe, at the time, Vice President Joe Biden meeting with Xi Jinping of China. Um, so the president is the lead diplomat of the United States. The president sets the course for US foreign policy, basically determines how we are going to relate to the rest of the world. The president creates treaties, negotiates them, but remember, treaties require Senate approval, and not just approval, but a two-thirds vote for a treaty to be ratified. That is a high bar. That's 67 senators to get a treaty ratified. That would be pretty tough in our modern polarized climate. It would be very challenging to get a treaty made. And if you're president, you don't want to be embarrassed and negotiate a whole treaty with another power only to have it fall through because your own Senate won't ratify it. That's what happened to Woodrow Wilson after World War One. You may remember from U.S. history, the Wilson negotiated that whole treaty, and then the Senate didn't ratify it. We had to create a separate peace. The U.S. didn't join the League of Nations. It was all very embarrassing. So, um, typically, what presidents will do instead of treaties is negotiate what are called executive agreements, and we'll talk more about what those are in just a moment. I mentioned already presidents meet with foreign leaders, they meet with diplomats from other countries, they determine foreign policy, they really set the agenda when it comes to foreign policy for what America's role will be in the world. And it's up to presidents to appoint ambassadors with majority of confirmation from the Senate, along with federal judges, along with cabinet members. Ambassadors to other nations are one of those positions that require a majority vote from the Senate. Executive agreements, as I alluded to earlier, these are agreements between leaders of countries that don't rise to the level of treaties. They are not as binding. In terms of legal power, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. But according to the Constitution, any treaties that we are in are the second most powerful law of the land. It goes Constitution, then treaties, then laws. So treaties are pretty high up there. They're binding, they're difficult to get out of. Executive agreements are much lower on the list. They have to exist within the legal framework, but they don't require Congress. A president can negotiate an executive agreement with another country without congressional approval. So there's a lot of advantages to that. You get around Congress, you don't need the Senate on your side, but there are disadvantages to that as well. Just like we talked about with executive orders, same kind of thing. A future president can undo an executive agreement without Congress. We saw this play out when President Obama negotiated the Iran nuclear agreement. He entered into an agreement with Iran and a few other countries to limit Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons. And then when President Trump took over, he pulled out of that agreement and wanted to put um, new punishing economic sanctions on Iran to try to limit their capacity to develop any sort of um, nuclear capability, whether nuclear weapons or nuclear power or anything. The Trump administration claimed that Iran was violating the deal anyway, and so um, they left the agreement, and President Trump didn't need Congress to leave that agreement. He could simply get out of it because it wasn't a treaty, it was an executive agreement. It is expected that President Biden will try to renegotiate a similar agreement with Iran. But again, these executive agreements, they're easier to get into because they don't require the Senate, but they're also easier to get out of because you don't need Congress. It's just whatever president is in charge, it's kind of up to their whims. Sort of along the same lines as chief diplomat is the commander in chief. The president leads our armed forces. We have a civilian leader of our armed forces, which is by design. That's the president. No military experience required to be president. Um, Remember, presidents don't technically declare war, but that's not as big a deal anymore. Presidents have broad military powers even outside of declaring war. So you can just use an authorization for the use of military force, and those give the presidents pretty broad war making powers. The Joint Chiefs are the highest ranking officers in each branch of the military, and they give the president military advice, kind of give the president options to respond in situations, and they are able to tell the president what is possible and what sort of the likely outcomes are in a given scenario. The president has the full nuclear arsenal at their command. The president is the only one who has the authority to launch a nuclear strike. There's no congressional approval needed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff aren't required. There's no check on that power. And in fact, there is a person who follows the president around with a briefcase of nuclear codes called the nuclear football. And that person goes with the president wherever the president goes and carries that briefcase with them in case the United States needs to respond with a nuclear strike at any moment. So, not sure if that makes you feel more or less safe, but that is how our nuclear arsenal has been handled basically since the Cold War. During the Cold War, it was believed we could be in a nuclear um, situation in any moment. And so we would always need to be ready to respond. And we haven't really updated procedures since then. I'll remind you about the War Powers Act. As I mentioned before, the president does not declare war. Only Congress can declare war. But remember, Congress delegated a lot of its war making powers to the president, and through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and through the War Powers Act. So, if the president wants to use the military to respond in a crisis, he's able to do so. He can notify Congress. He has to notify Congress within 48 hours. He has 60 days to get congressional approval. And like I said, once he gets that approval, those approvals are pretty broad and pretty far reaching. And so they give the president really broad war making powers. And in addition to the armed forces themselves, the president also leads our intelligence network, the CIA, and all the various intelligence collecting agencies. Remember, we'll talk more about this later on, but the Patriot Act gives the president really broad powers and the executive branch broad powers when it comes to conducting surveillance. And that's something that has come under more scrutiny recently, where um, we've got a lot of legislators and a lot of activists questioning whether or not we want the executive branch to be able to broadly collect a lot of electronic data on American citizens without more oversight. But for the moment, the president does have pretty broad control over the intelligence network as well. And the president has access to the most top secret, most up to date intelligence in the world, gets a daily briefing on it. It's literally called the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief, where every day he is updated on the most important, most up to date intelligence from around the world. So, chief legislator, of course, technically we've got separation of powers. The president and the um, Congress are two different branches, but the president does have a legislative role. Each year, the president gives what's called the State of the Union address. So, the State of the Union address is where the president outlines his legislative goals, his legislative agenda for the coming year. These are all the things my administration has accomplished. These are all the things that I want to accomplish in the future. And Congress, I need your help. He kind of uses the State of the Union to light a fire under Congress and get them going. Remember, the president, of course, has the constitutional power to sign or veto bills, sign them into law, veto to reject them. Um, we've talked about the pocket veto before. If the president gets a bill from Congress and then Congress adjourns within 10 days and the president does nothing with the bill, then it is pocket vetoed. But that's a very specific set of circumstances. He has to get the bill, and then Congress has to adjourn, and then he has to do nothing with it. It is pocket vetoed. The line item veto is unconstitutional. Congress gave the president the power to have the line item veto, the power to go through a bill and veto parts of it and then sign the rest into law. But the Supreme Court ruled that power unconstitutional. The president has to sign the whole bill or veto the whole bill. The president can also issue what are called signing statements when he signs a bill. Basically, he tries to clarify how he's going to enforce a bill. There is not a ton of legal framework when a president signs or issues a signing statement. Usually, presidents use them to express frustration with a bill. They may feel like they were politically backed into a corner, like they're being forced to sign it. Maybe they know that if they vetoed it, it would be overridden, or if they vetoed it, it would just be really unpopular for them. But if they're upset about it, they will issue a signing statement basically saying, I'm signing this into law, but I plan as much as possible not to enforce particular parts of it. So it's sort of a way to be a little petulant as president and say, I don't really like this bill, but I'm only signing it because I feel like I have to. Executive orders, we've mentioned already. Executive orders are orders that have the force of law that the president can issue without Congress. Basically, they are able to use their power as chief executive to issue regulations, issue rules clarifying how they want the law to be enforced. And these executive orders, over time, presidents have issued more of them, and the ones that they have issued have become a lot more ambitious. So presidents are trying to push the boundaries of what they've been able to get away with by executive order. President Obama issued an executive order called DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, about immigration. And that executive order said it dealt with children who were brought to the United States illegally. And through the DACA program, they came forward, they identified themselves to the government, they said where they lived, where they were going to school, where they worked, they showed that they didn't have criminal background, and provided they checked in with the government periodically through the DACA program, they were able to avoid deportation. And all of that was accomplished by executive order, not by law. So conservatives who maybe said that they liked what it accomplished still expressed frustration that President Obama did this by executive order. Flip that around. When President Trump became president, he also issued a lot of executive orders, tried to accomplish a lot by executive orders. Then you had Democrats expressing frustration that the president seems to be trying to accomplish a lot by executive order. And certainly Joe Biden will face the same criticism. Presidents tend to use executive orders when they feel like they want to accomplish things quickly or when they feel like Congress is being stubborn and they can't get anything done. So if there's a lot of gridlock in Congress, especially if at least one of the houses of Congress is controlled by the other party, presidents will try to push the bounds of what they can get away with by executive order. And the only way to undo an executive order is for the law to change. That means Congress would have to act, for the courts to intervene and declare an executive order unconstitutional, which they can certainly do, or for the sitting president to undo an executive order. So that's another issue with executive orders. You can pass one, but then um, the president who follows you can just undo it without needing Congress. Presidents, of course, have to work with Congress. President Biden just stated his goal for an immigration bill, but it looks like it's going to be complicated. It's going to be tough to get it through Congress. With the filibuster in place, he would need at least 10 Republican senators on board with it. And that's going to be a challenge. That tension, that difficulty to compromise with Congress increases as you approach the midterms. The party that doesn't control the presidency doesn't want to help pass a bill that's going to make the president's party look better. So the party out of power, the party out of the presidency, has this huge incentive to just obstruct until the midterms, because the midterms are always right around the corner. Um, the political news is already talking about the 2022 midterms, what's going to happen in the House, what's going to happen in the Senate. And so the party out of power has this huge incentive not to work with the president's party, which can make compromise very challenging. Of course, the president proposes legislation. I talked about President Biden's immigration bill that he has proposed. President Trump's big legislative accomplishment was tax reform. President Obama's big legislation was the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare. We've talked about other examples. Presidents have sort of their signature, their landmark legislation. The New Deal, of course, being Franklin Roosevelt's programs, and NCLB, we've talked about No Child Left Behind as George W. Bush's. All right, chief of party, there's nothing in the Constitution about political parties. So that means there's nothing in the Constitution about the president's role as the chief of parties. But the president is sort of the unofficial head of their political party. They set the agenda. Certainly for the Republican Party, President Trump sort of altered the direction of the Republican Party. After the 2012 presidential election, the National Republican Party did what they called an autopsy of the 2012 election. And the conclusion they reached was that they needed to be softer on immigration in order to appeal to a broader network of voters. When Donald Trump, then candidate Donald Trump, became the nominee for president, he moved the party in a completely different direction. He took a much more hard line on immigration. That worked in 2016. In 2020, during a presidential debate, uh, then candidate Joe Biden said, I am the Democratic Party, basically saying that it doesn't matter what other members of the party. He was being criticized for something Bernie Sanders believed, but he basically said, I'm not Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders doesn't represent the Democratic Party. I do. He was making a nod to this role as the chief of the party. It's normal for the president to campaign for others in the party. Here you have, at the time, President elect Joe Biden, after winning the presidential election in Georgia, campaigning for two Senate candidates for the Georgia runoffs, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. So, as the midterms get closer, I would expect to see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris out campaigning for other Democrats as well. And like I said, the president chooses what parts of the platform to focus on. Right now, the Biden administration is focused on COVID relief. In the future, they're talking about immigration. They're also talking about infrastructure as something to focus on. And so they are sort of directing the party towards the things that they want to, that their administration wants to accomplish. And the last thing we'll talk about today is the president's role as the chief of the economy. The president does have an economic role. The president always proposes a budget. Like I said before, Congress usually doesn't think much of the president's budget. Usually they scrap it and start over. But the president does issue a budget that basically shows what their priorities are. And there is a bureaucratic agency that helps the president do that. It's called the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. The AP exam has a habit of throwing that in as a multiple choice question. What's the name of the department that helps the president write the budget. It's the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. We're going to talk about different types of economic policy as we go, but there's one type called fiscal policy. That is the government's policy of taxing and spending. Taxing and spending is a huge philosophical question. Who do we tax and how much and what do we spend the money on? Right? Should we tax all income equally? Should people who make more income pay higher taxes? Should people who make their money through stocks and investments pay higher taxes? As the system is structured right now, investments are taxed much lower than income is. What should we spend the money on? How do we spend the tax money that we raise? And of course, debt is a huge question there too. How much debt is too much? Is the national debt a problem? Will the national debt crowd out other borrowing? Will it raise inflation? Um, all of those are deep philosophical questions that typically don't have very clear answers. But there is this phrase from the 1992 Bill Clinton campaign, where Bill Clinton's campaign manager uh, hung a poster in their campaign headquarters that said, "It's the economy, stupid." There was a recession going on at the time. And so he was trying to get the rest of the Clinton campaign to realize we need to focus on the economy. Everything needs to come back to the economy. It is sort of conventional wisdom that if the economy is doing well, presidents tend to get reelected. If the economy is doing poorly, they tend not to. That a lot of presidential approval is tied to the economy. It's not entirely clear that that's borne out in the past couple of years, but that, like I said, is sort of the conventional wisdom that a president's political future is tied to how well the economy is doing, which may not seem fair because the economy is not always completely in the president's control. That 1992 recession probably wasn't the current president George H.W. Bush's fault, at least not entirely. The when President Clinton took office and the economy turned around and it did really well in the 90s, that probably didn't have much to do with Bill Clinton's performance. Presidents have a little bit of short term control over the economy, but in terms of long term economic fortunes, it's really difficult for presidents to exert a lot of control over the economy. So it may not seem fair, but how the economy is doing is a huge factor in the president's fortunes. So we'll pick up there tomorrow, Tuesday, which will be the next time I see you, and we'll talk about the expansion of presidential power and a few other things. So make sure you got the must know quiz done as well, and that you're ready to talk more about how the president's power has expanded over time. All right, see you tomorrow.